Everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 9th of January and today I will be mainly focusing on Bakhmut, Soledar, Pidhorodne, and some of these neighboring and adjacent towns and talk about the recent developments since my last video, which was made 2 days ago roughly. And so before we get into that, please like and subscribe. And now let's talk about the situation over here. So I'm going to start off with Pidhorodne. Bakhmut, really there aren't that many changes besides really positional fighting. Ukrainian special forces have been geolocated targeting Russian positions which are deeper in Bakhmut, but it's nothing new, at least based on my map. Maybe some Ukrainian sources may have updated their maps based on these geolocations, but mine was already showing their control of the industrial area and of this forested belt over here, and so I don't find that really noteworthy. What I really want to mention is Pidhorodne because this is a very important town, and this is really what I'm telling in the video for a reason. And so I'm going to talk about how this town was captured. Originally, most of the pressure on the town was coming from the south. So we saw how the Wagner group, they captured this gas station over here a few months ago, and that was really their forward position in this area. So from there, they steadily took over some platoon posts, some observation posts, some sniper firing positions all around these open fields over here, which I'm going to circle. And methodically they cleared it out, but then they were able to apply a lot of pressure onto the southern part of the town. And so the unit that was stationed over here, the 115th Separate Mechanized Brigade, and there was also the 57th Brigade, maybe some of his battalions were stationed over there, mainly the 115th Brigade, which is a territorial defense unit, by the way, and also the 17th Tank Brigade. They were really focusing the most of their efforts on holding back the Russians in the south. And so this presented an opportunity for the Russians when they broke through at Soledar to attack through the north and through the east. And so that's what we saw happen. As the Russians took over this road over here connecting Bakhmutske with Bakhmut, they were able to set up firing positions and mortars on these sort of hilly areas. They're not that high up, but they do overlook towns like Krasna, Hora, and also Pidhorodne, which is located on a lower elevation relative to these fields over here. Given the fact that they are located near the E40 highway and that it is a settlement, usually they are on lower elevations. And so using these new positions, they were able to attack the forested areas. And at the same time, they broke through the Ukrainian lines on the eastern outskirts of the town. And so you had these two-pronged assaults, and because there was so much pressure coming from so many directions, the Ukrainians were being spread thin, and so they just decided that in order to prevent the entire Ukrainian line from being decimated and from being encircled, they decided to withdraw beforehand. And so that's why we have this geolocated video, which is from a few days ago, admittedly, showing Ukrainian forces retreating from Pidhorodne, and these were men from the 57th Brigade. So I do need to update my map to show that this unit is no longer located in Pidhorodne. The only argument that could be made is that perhaps Ukraine still has a presence to the west of the E40 highway, because there's no proof that Russia is actually over here. And that's true. At this point, I think it's probably a gray zone in that for the most part, the Ukrainians have retreated across the Bakhmutovka River, and they're using that as a new line, and that they might be firing through this gray zone over here, because they 100% still have control of Ehidny and the northern parts of Bakhmut, and this is where they're going to put up last stand, you could say, because once this line over here falls, then the entire northern supply route to Bakhmut is dismembered, and that means that there's no way to send reinforcements, which the garrison in Bakhmut desperately needs. There's no way to send supplies, there's no way to communicate, and so it is very important to keep this road connected. And even now that the Russians aren't in control of this road, they are very close to it, and so they could, you could say, have some level of fire control. Not total fire control, but they can pretty easily fire mortars or even artillery at this point onto the road over here. Much more difficult to maintain cohesion. I'll also add that another good thing for Russia, based on taking Pidhorodne, is that they now have full control of this hill over here, which is just to the north of the town. And the reason why this is important is because it does overlook the town of Pidhorodne, which is again to the north of Bakhmut. Again, very important as a supply hub. Same thing with Krasna Hora. It overlooks Krasna Hora. I do want to give everybody a visual representation of this. Here you have the rough front line for today, and you can see that I have the topographic map from Google Earth. So here we have Pidhorodne. I'm going to change it to a 2D, 3D view over here. You can see that over here Pidhorodne is located on a low elevation, but that the hill is a bit sticking out, just like a bit higher in terms of elevation. You could also see how these forested areas over here are higher in elevation, and that they can overlook the town of Krasna Hora, which is located first of all near a road, but also near a river. And so you could see there's more vegetation over here. It is on a lower elevation, and you could also see fortifications that were built over here a while ago. These look like earthen mounds or something of the sorts. And so now that the war has actually gotten close to this area, I'm sure that Ukraine has converted this into some sort of fortified area. You could also see on Russia's military maps that they have this specific area marked as a fortified area. They have these little X's, and a lot of those are etched around this general area. And so I'm sure that Ukraine has some sort of fortification set up over here. They might also have some around the Solidarsky Lake, which is also overlooked by the fields over here. Not by that much. You can see it's almost flat, but there is a bit of a, you could see there is a bit of a bulge. I'm not saying it's that important, but it is good to at least control higher ground for obviously observation purposes and also for firing purposes. And so that's why Russia, at least in that regard, in terms of geography, they have that advantage. The Ukrainians also have some silver lining, because obviously to the west you have these higher elevated areas, these open fields, and they are actually higher elevated than the eastern fields that are controlled by Russia. And so in a way they can give cover for the different supplies that are passing through these routes over here. Let me visualize that here. You can see they're passing by over here, and then you have cover from over here. Now let's move on to the situation in Soledar. So in Soledar, a lot has happened since I last recorded a video. I've seen a lot of rumors on the Ukrainian side of some counterattacks. And it is true that Ukraine was able to conduct some sort of limited counterattacks on the first day that Russia made their huge gains. You could say January 6th, January 7th. These were, first of all, very small gains, but they were also temporary, so it was sort of back and forth fighting. And so the main example I have is of the Salta mines 1 through 3, which are circled over here. So Ukraine, they had originally lost it, but then they launched a counterattack that was really localized to that specific area. And they did re-enter it for a time, but Wagner Group has now fully solidified control over the salt mines and the shafts that could lead to the entrances to the underground tunnels, which is interesting, because if there is any sort of Ukrainian presence there, then there might be right now Wagner operations to clear it out using their control of the mine shafts. But anyway, we did see from this Ukrainian journalist called Yuri Butusov that Ukraine had not fully retreated from Soledar, which I know that the title of my other video said that they were, but really what I was referring to is the retreat from the first line towards the second line, which is around this urban cluster. So they did have at least some sort of withdrawal, but what I'm referring to when talking about Yuri Butusov is that Ukraine has sent reinforcements into the city of Soledar. So this journalist reported about the presence of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade in the city, and that they've been sent in from the Zaporizhia front, where they were supposed to conduct offensive operations towards the direction of Tokmak, Polohi, and then potentially Melitopol. But as I've discussed before, because of the pressure on Bakhmut, a lot of these units that were originally in Kherson, then in Zaporizhia, they had to be moved to Bakhmut in order to relieve the pressure over here. And that means that any hope of an offensive towards Melitopol has been put on the back burner for now, until this situation is dealt with. And so while we've seen some Ukrainian attempts at stabilizing the line, it's not been that successful. Sure, the Russians have not gained really anything around the Mokra Plotova River. We've really seen this front line static here for a few days, We've also seen some limited gains to the north of the salt mines 1 through 3. The Russians did get some gains over here, taking over this government office, this cafe, and really the fighting is now around this small hospital and gym over here. The Ukrainians had a video filmed of themselves trying to discreetly move from house to house in this general vicinity, and so we know the fighting is there as of recently. We also know that the Russians have cleared out this entire, I don't know if you could say it's forested area, but all of these trees over here. There are some residential blocks over there, and there is also a cemetery, so the Russians cleared all of that out now, and so they can put pressure onto the main apartment buildings, the city center, you could say, using those positions now, which could also sort of try to flank the Ukrainian positions at the hospital and attack the Ukrainian administrative building, which is still under their control, although a lot of the fighting has been very close to it. You could say maybe 500 meters, now it's closer to 400, 300 meters away from the administrative building. But while all this has been happening, while a lot of meat grinder sort of fighting has been going on in the center of Soledar, the Russians have been flanking it. So they originally flanked it in order to achieve their original success, and now they've continued to flank the city. So they took over, obviously, these fields over here. They had a lot of control over here, and since then, they've been able to expand their control to the south. There's a ravine over here, which is also a local hill. It's called, according to the locals, Yurchina Gora. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Yurchina Gora. And so this hill overlooks the apartment buildings over here and the garage, the garages, these garbage dumps as well. Maybe there are some houses here as well, which are located over here. I'm circling it. It also overlooks one of the supply lines into Soledar from the north, and another supply line coming in from the northwest, and another one coming in from the southwest. And so this gives Russia a very good position to overlook the city center and the supply lines at the same time. Let me try to visualize that on Google Earth for everybody. So here we have the front line, and the hill that I'm referring to is located over here. You can see it is a bit elevated. The difference isn't that large, as I've said before, but you can see how there is a bit of a depression over here around the hospital, and this is where Ukrainian supplies are coming in from. You can see they're coming in through this train station primarily, and then going into the front line, and then through this smaller road over here. And so by having positions in this hill, it is easier to attack the convoys that are crossing through over there. Now, the Russians, using their positions, they entered the apartment buildings, and since then there's been street-to-street fighting, house-to-house fighting. Every house has been meticulously fought over and cleared out by the Russians. We've seen videos from some of these houses of really immense Ukrainian casualties as they're trying to hold on to these lines over here because they understand the threat that could be posed if all of these apartments had fallen, which now most of them have fallen, although there are some more over here which are still under Ukrainian control. The ones that Russia has taken over, they've turned into sniper positions. So now you're seeing these sniper fights between the Ukrainian soldiers in their respective apartments and the Wagner Group ones in theirs. There's also school number 13, which is a fortified area which Russia is trying to assault right now, which would give them some pretty good positions to isolate the Ukrainians and force them out of the city. And so that's really the situation now. It's being flanked. The Ukrainians still have control over the not salt mines 1 through 3, so I need to correct that, but over this specific part of the salt mine, which is a different shaft, which is different from salt mines 1 through 3, which are located around here. You can see around the touristical area. So that's really what's going on in Soledar. You have the 128th Brigade over here. They've really incurred some very heavy losses here, even more than in Kherson, you could say at this point. And they are still trying to hold the line to the best of their abilities, but we have seen some units withdraw, including the 17th Tank Brigade, which does have some of its battalions, especially the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, fighting in Soledar. Some of them have withdrawn, and we've seen videos of them recording the fighting over here. They recorded it on the heights, so I would assume that they were filming the videos around here, around Pidhorodne, and then they were facing towards the east around Soledar, and they were showing the very heavy fighting. You could see some huge explosions I've heard that the Russians have brought in their TOS-1 thermobaric weapons systems, and so that could be used to clear out a lot of these tightly packed complexes, whether they be apartments, schools, hospitals, all these large structures. A lot of them get decimated by the TOS-1 thermobaric weapons. We've seen this happen in Pesky. It was used in Bakhmut for a certain period. Now they're being moved into Soledar, which makes sense, especially given the fact that there are really no civilians left over here. So it doesn't have that much of a effect on the civilian population, besides just destroying all the houses in the area. Now in Pidhorodne, the situation is also important, because if Pidhorodne can be taken before Krasna Hora, then that can turn the entire fortress into liability, because the Ukrainians would be stationed there and they wouldn't be able to effectively retreat from the line over here. And then Parasokivka and Krasna Hora would both be threatened because Russia would have their positions in Pidhorodne. And so we have a video geolocation of a destroyed BMP-1 and BTR-80 in Pidhorodne, geolocated to this area. I think it's probably recent, although a lot of people have been commenting about these videos that have been released allegedly from Soledar and its environs, and saying that they're old because they don't have snow. And like, that's possible. Sometimes there's not snow in Soledar. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not recorded recently. Other videos do actually have some snow located, maybe on roofs and stuff like that, if you look closely. So I am inclined to believe that most of these videos are recent, especially given the fact that they've been geolocated to areas where we've only seen fighting recently. So this is one example. Over here, there was a car that was trying to drive up north, and it passed by these destroyed Ukrainian armored personnel carriers, and we didn't really see much of a Ukrainian presence in the town. I'm not saying that Russia is in control of the town now, but I'm saying that they are in an advantageous position to attack it later on based on the Google Earth. Let me show everybody where Pidhorodne is located. You can see Pidhorodne is over here. So Russia would first have to cross over the road which connects Soledar and Krasna Hora, which could be difficult given the fact that it's now controlled by Ukraine. And then they'd also have to take over the village itself, which could, again, be difficult because Ukraine does have control of these sites over here. So I'm not trying to discount their positions. I'm just saying that it looks like it might be abandoned at the moment, or that there isn't a permanent settlement of Ukrainian troops in the area at the moment. But in terms of the situation in Soledar, that's really mostly what I had to say. I do want to highlight the fact that Russia has been trying to strike the Ukrainian rear, not in Soledar and Bakhmut necessarily. I'm saying a bit deeper into the Ukrainian line. So I'm talking about like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. We've seen a increase in Russian strikes on these cities, which are being used as stops, and then a lot of supply hubs that are then moved into the front line around Bakhmut and Soledar. And so that's why it's important. If you can cut off that supply line, then it makes it much more difficult to defend the front line. So in recent days, we've seen Russia and Ministry of Defense allege that they conducted airstrikes on Kramatorsk. They mentioned 2 specific dormitories that they say were destroyed. So we have, first of all, images of these 2 hotels. I'm not going to show them here, but we can see that in the images that the craters were on the outside of the structure. And so they didn't actually land inside the structure. It landed very close to it in both instances, but it didn't actually impact the structure directly. And so there might have been some sort of just blast effect, which destroyed the windows, for instance, or some of the interior, but it didn't cause the structure to entirely collapse. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense claim is that it killed 600 Ukrainian soldiers. And so this is pretty unlikely based on the fact that a lot of journalists were there on the ground, and they reported, first of all, that there was no signs of ambulances. The locals did not report any ambulances coming afterwards. I've also seen, obviously, the images of the craters. Some are alleging that there were either S-300 systems that were used, but I think it's more likely that tornado MLRS systems were used. Either way, it does seem like it missed, so it probably didn't kill that many people. Even if it was a direct hit, I don't know if there were that many Ukrainian troops stationed there. It is possible because we saw something like that happen in Russia with Makivka, for instance. But again, it wasn't on target. But I will add that the Russian Ministry of Defense did say that there were 8 airstrikes on the night of January 6th, or it could have been January 7th, but we only saw images of 2 areas that were struck. So perhaps, if Russia is being honest in that regard, that there were 6 other targets that we don't have information for, and that maybe in those instances there was some sort of target successfully hit, and that the Ukrainians incurred in those cases some significant casualties. But that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys